In August 1945, American bombers dropped the first ever atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. Soon after, the Japanese emperor expressed his intention to surrender. And ever since, a fierce debate has been going on among historians. Why did the US really drop the bombs, and what really made Japan surrender? Few events of the Second World War have triggered more historical debate than those of August 1945. Historians have long argued whether the atomic bombs were necessary and which factors were most important in causing the Japanese to surrender. The conventional view, supported by orthodox historians, mostly follows the mainstream post-war American perspective, that the bombs were the decisive factor in the Japanese surrender. But other historians have argued a different view, that the intervention of the Soviet Union in the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, actually triggered the Japanese surrender and arguably made the bombs unnecessary. This view is often called revisionist, since it revises or changes the older orthodox argument. Evolving arguments are a normal part of historians' work in trying to explain the past, and there are differences within the orthodox and revisionist schools of thought on the bomb. So these labels are a bit simplified to help us get to the core of the issue. But first, let's take a step back and establish the facts. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied and Soviet forces. In July, the victors met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin. Near the top of the agenda was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the USSR was still neutral. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his 1943 promise to the Brits and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria, plus South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. He also revealed the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace feelers since 1943. By 1945, it was clear they wanted to use the neutral USSR as a mediator to end the war on better terms. Now remember, testing vague peace ideas with a potential mediator country is not the same as being willing to surrender. All the while, Japan's military was preparing the home islands for defense and blocked any serious peace efforts by politicians. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who favored peace, did not want it at any price. Meanwhile, at Potsdam, US President Harry Truman received a short telegram from the US on July 16th. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet completed, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. This message meant that the first atomic weapons test in New Mexico had been a success. On July 24th, Truman casually informed Stalin of, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, equally casually, suggested good use of the bomb could be made against Japan. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR didn't sign. They called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face, quote, prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government was divided on how to respond. Emperor Hirohito was head of state, but the country was actually governed by the so-called Big Six cabinet ministers. 3 ministers wanted to ask the Allies for clarification, while the other 3, all military, wanted to reject the proclamation. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored it, but they could not ignore what happened next. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It exploded 600 meters above the city, causing ground temperatures to reach 4,000 degrees centigrade. Nearly everyone within 1 kilometer was killed instantly, and those within a 3.5 kilometer radius were terribly burned. High school student Yamaoka Michiko recalled the moment of the explosion. There was no sound. I felt something strong. It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. I thought I would be the only one to die. I said to myself, goodbye, Mom. The bomb destroyed 70,000 of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings and killed up to 110,000 people. The White House released a statement. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So the bomb had been dropped and Hiroshima destroyed. At the same time, Japan's leaders were discussing surrender. The initial Japanese response to the American threat to drop more bombs was to delay. Military ministers blocked the planned cabinet meeting, but Japanese diplomats did quickly meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. When the Japanese ambassador met Molotov on August 8th to discuss peace, the Soviet diplomat instead handed him a declaration of war. The next day, 1.5 million Soviet troops invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing Japan's Kwantung army. The Japanese cabinet finally met but couldn't agree on what to do. Civilian ministers wanted to surrender on the condition the emperor could remain, while most military ministers demanded no occupation, voluntary disarmament of Japanese forces, and Japanese-controlled war crime trials. While they discussed, the second atomic bomb hit Nagasaki, killing 40,000. The emperor himself now intervened with an unprecedented sacred decision to surrender with one condition: his own retention as monarch. The Japanese sent these terms to the Americans on August 10th, and the US didn't refuse, but didn't accept either. They simply repeated that the Japanese people would choose their own government. On August 15th, after a badly organized military coup by junior officers failed, Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender unconditionally. Fighting in Manchuria stopped on August 16th, and the war formally came to an end September 2nd, 1945. So that is the timeline of the end of World War II in Asia. But why did the US decide to drop the bombs? Orthodox historians have argued it was to end the war sooner and save American and Japanese lives by avoiding a bloody invasion of Japan. Since 1943, the US military had been drawing up plans for a possible invasion of Japan. They expected the Japanese would resist with fanaticism based on assessments like this one from former ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew. "I know Japan. I lived there for 10 years. The Japanese will not crack. They will not crack morally or psychologically or economically, even when eventual defeat stares them in the face. They will pull in their belts another notch, reduce their rations from a bowl to half a bowl, and fight to the bitter end." The bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 reinforced these claims. The invasion was to happen in two phases. Allied troops would land at Kyushu on November 1st, 1945, then capture the Tokyo Plain in March 1946. The Japanese Ketsu-go defense plan was not to defeat the invasion, but to inflict enough losses on the Americans so Japan could get better peace terms. The Americans knew the Japanese were preparing and expected to face 4.5 million Japanese troops in Japan, with 625,000 in Kyushu alone. This was about a 1-to-1 ratio between attackers and defenders, far too close for an offensive operation of this scale. US planners used this intelligence about Japanese troop numbers and the known casualty rates from Okinawa to estimate potential losses for a full invasion. By August 1945, they expected between 250,000 and 1 million killed and wounded. The higher estimate was double US casualties in Europe for the entire war. The Orthodox perspective claims that the estimates caused US leaders like Secretary of War Henry Stimson to lose faith in an invasion. But recent research suggests that the casualty estimates were probably much exaggerated. Planners had no reliable methodology to use, and US intelligence didn't recognize the poor quality of Japanese units. Modern estimates of possible US casualties run as low as 20,000. Regardless, Orthodox historians maintain it was the expectation of casualties that mattered. The atomic bombs, proven successful in July, provided Truman with an alternative. On receiving news of the test's success, Truman wrote to his wife, "I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed." Truman was also under public pressure to end the war soon with minimal losses, while simultaneously not letting Japan off lightly. The bombs ticked both of these boxes. After the bombings, opinion polls showed 85% of Americans supported their use, and 23% wanted to drop even more. But the atomic bombs were not guaranteed to work, and for this reason, some Orthodox historians say Truman still wanted Soviet help. Revisionist historians, on the other hand, claim Soviet intervention became Truman's worst-case scenario. For revisionists, the atomic bombings had more to do with containing the Soviet Union than with defeating Japan. The dropping of the atomic bombs was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first major operation of the Cold War with Russia. They argue that although Truman wanted Soviet assistance before Potsdam, he then changed his mind. Revisionists highlight that Stalin never received an official invitation to join the war. Instead, they suggest that Truman wanted an insurance policy in case the bombs didn't work. Stalin provided this by confirming Operation August Storm would start on August 15th. Once Truman had reliable data from the bomb test success on July 21st, revisionists claim that he drastically shifted his position to ending the war before the August 15th Soviet offensive could begin. This led the revisionists to conclude that Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw a chance to limit Soviet influence and prevent the USSR from getting the Japanese islands and influence in northern China that they'd been promised. Some in the US government worried that the Soviets couldn't be trusted to respect an agreement, especially on the question of free elections in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, any deal involving China still needed to be run past Chiang Kai-shek. Truman himself wrote his opinion in his memoirs. "I was not willing to let Russia reap the fruits of a long and bitter and gallant effort in which she had had no part." Revisionists also suggest that far from offering Japan an opportunity to surrender, the Potsdam Proclamation was deliberately designed to be unacceptable, thereby justifying the use of the bombs. Several members of the US delegation, like Stimson, wanted to adjust the unconditional surrender demand to guarantee the emperor, but he was overruled by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Burns. But when the US dropped the Hiroshima bomb, revisionists argue that instead of intimidating the Soviets, it actually spurred them on. Stalin knew about the bomb program thanks to his spies, but the test was a surprise. Apparently outraged, he brought forward the invasion date to August 9th. So the orthodox argument that the bombs were dropped to save lives has been questioned by revisionists who argue that it was primarily to prevent Soviet gains in Asia. A minority of revisionists have even argued that the US dropped the bombs partly out of grim scientific curiosity or to justify the expense of developing them, but the evidence for this is weaker. That said, orthodox and revisionist schools also disagree about another critical question: why exactly did Japan surrender? Orthodox historians suggest that Japan would fight on if it felt that its defensive plan to kill as many Allied troops as possible had a chance of working. The bombs, though, weakened Japanese belief that determined defense and Soviet mediation might end the war on better terms. According to this line of thought, Japanese leaders now accepted that their country could be bombed into submission, especially if the US was going to drop more atomic bombs after the first two. Maybe they would even drop one on Tokyo. In reality, Truman planned to scale back bombings after Nagasaki, and Tokyo was never an atomic target. But the Japanese didn't know this. Their fears, Orthodox historians claim, were increased by the shock of the atomic bombs, since Japanese scientists had theorized them, but were nowhere near developing them. Japan's leaders also considered the atomic bombs a critical threat to Japanese civilians. Orthodox historians have pointed to evidence like this statement from Hirohito to a close advisor. "Now that things have come to this impasse, we must bow to the inevitable. No matter what happens to my safety, we should lose no time in ending the war so as not to have another tragedy like this." Orthodox historians also say that the Soviet attack was not all that important in Japan's decision to capitulate. Japanese leaders knew a Soviet offensive was possible, so its shock impact was minimal. One piece of evidence on this point is a statement by Deputy Army Chief Torashiro Kawabe. "Although we have long worried about the question of Soviet entry, a surprise attack with this new atomic weapon was beyond our wildest dreams." In the orthodox argument, the Soviet attack was concerning to the Japanese, but not a critical threat to the home islands or the Ketsugo plan. In any case, Japan expected to lose Manchuria in a peace deal anyway. So the orthodox position is that Japan surrendered because of the destruction of the atomic bombs and the potential for more of the same. The revisionist approach, though, sees it very differently. They suggest that the impact of the bombs has been exaggerated since the war, while the impact of the Soviet invasion has been minimized. Firstly, revisionists argue that the destruction from the atomic bombs was not so different from the impact of conventional US strategic bombing. On March 9th, a US raid on Tokyo killed 84,000 people, more than the lower estimates for Hiroshima and more than the immediate death toll at Nagasaki. In any case, most Japanese cities were already destroyed by the time the atomic bombs were invented. Historian Robert Pape put it this way: if one defines the hostage as major and secondary cities with over 100,000 people, then the hostage was nearly dead before the atomic bombs fell. After the war, a US strategic bombing survey estimated that the atomic bomb did as much damage as 210 conventional bomber sorties. In August 1945, 21st Bomber Command was flying 1,200 sorties every week. Revisionists claim that this reduced the shock of the atomic bomb, since the Japanese leadership already expected mass death from more conventional bombing or an invasion. The Japanese military didn't really react much to the first atomic bomb and even doubted an atomic weapon had been used at all. That's why they said they had more important things to do than attend the cabinet meeting on August 8th. According to the revisionists, the atomic bombings did not encourage surrender and instead reinforced the Japanese plan to defend the home islands and seek Soviet mediation. In fact, Japanese generals reasoned atomic bombs wouldn't even be much use during an invasion. The most important reason Japan abandoned the plan to fight to the end, in revisionist eyes, was the Soviet declaration of war. The atomic bombs created confusion at the top, but the Soviet attack was the realization of the worst-case scenario. Once the Soviets declared war, all hope for mediation via the USSR was gone. Although somewhat anticipated, revisionists suggest this resulted in an even bigger shock than the bomb. One piece of evidence for this is General Kawabe's post-war statement. Since Tokyo was not directly affected by the bombing, the full force of the shock was not felt. In comparison, the Soviet entry into the war was a great shock when it actually came. It gave us all the more severe shock and alarm because we'd been in constant fear that the vast Red Army forces in Europe were now being turned against us. Kawabe is a prime example of how isolated statements from leading figures can be contradictory. In the previous section of this video, his words are used to support the orthodox position as well. Tokyo also worried the Soviet involvement might trigger communist uprisings in Japan, which might end the imperial dynasty for good. Revisionists argue that this is what convinced even the military to accept the Potsdam Proclamation. For revisionist historians, the opinions of military leaders in the Big Six are particularly important. They were the strongest faction within the cabinet and had previously vetoed peace overtures. But after the Soviet invasion, revisionists say that even the military leaders decided to surrender, although they still debated its exact terms. The senior officers accepted Hirohito's sacred decision and never launched a full-scale military coup. Revisionists also claim that Hirohito was not motivated to save civilian lives, since he didn't do anything to stop the deaths from conventional strategic bombing, and that his real priority was saving his family's imperial regalia and shrines from invasion or communist revolution. So the orthodox thinking is that the bombs forced the Japanese to surrender, while the revisionists argue it was the Soviet intervention. All these discussions have led historians to wonder whether the US might have forced Japan to surrender a different way, without the bombs at all. One of the most debated what-ifs is the idea that Japan was likely to surrender before a US invasion took place. Revisionists have floated the possibility that if the Allies had guaranteed the Emperor in the Potsdam Proclamation, the Japanese would have given up sooner. Even the US War Department Operation Division recognized the importance of the Emperor. The primary intention in issuing the proclamation is to induce Japan's surrender, and thus avoid the heavy casualties implied in a fight to the finish. It is almost universally accepted that the basic point on which the acceptance of surrender terms will hinge lies in the question of the disposition of the emperor and his dynasty. Therefore, from the military point of view, it seems necessary to state unequivocally what we intend to do with regard to the emperor. The revisionists maintain that the US failure to heed this advice and the dropping of the bombs probably delayed the end of the war. They also raise other possibilities that might have led to Japanese surrender instead of the bombs, like keeping up the naval blockade or conventional bombing. Some even think that a Soviet invasion of the island of Hokkaido would have put an immediate stop to the war as well. As you can imagine, Orthodox historians have energetically criticized these points. They say if the US guaranteed the emperor, the Japanese might have interpreted it as a sign of weak resolve and kept on fighting. Important government figures in Japan gave no indication that they would consider surrender before August, despite the already devastating effects of strategic bombing and the blockade. Historian Richard Frank is unequivocal. In the face of this evidence, it is fantasy, not history, to believe that the end of the war was at hand before the use of the atomic bomb. Orthodox arguments also point to the high death rates that further strategic bombing, a starvation blockade, or a Soviet invasion would have caused, perhaps taking more lives than the bombs did even without a US invasion, including amongst the peoples under Japanese occupation. An additional argument is that the bombs actually gave Japan a justification for surrender. Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizo's post-war thoughts provide some evidence for this. The atomic bomb was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. There were those who said that the Japanese armed forces were not defeated. It was in science that Japan was defeated, so the military will not bring shame on themselves by surrendering. The orthodox versus revisionist argument is further complicated by tricky historical sources too. There's a lack of fully reliable primary sources for August 1945, and many of the letters or diaries written at the time are incomplete or they're contradictory. Post-war memoirs are also problematic since many decision-makers tried to put themselves in a good light in the new environment of the Cold War or war crimes trials. Evidence obtained from post-war US interrogations has also been questioned. Aside from sources, the whole debate relies on the assumption that a single person or unit was responsible for important decision-making. In reality, such complex decisions are the result of networks of people, power struggles, attitudes, institutions, and personalities that can also change their position over time. So, did the US drop the atomic bombs to avoid a costly invasion, or to limit Soviet influence in Asia? Did Japan surrender because of the bombs or because of the Soviet declaration of war? And did the bombs ultimately save lives, or could more people have lived if they'd not been dropped? Even today, almost 80 years later, the debates around the end of the Second World War are just as heated and explosive as ever. And as usual, you can find all our sources for this video in the video description. If you're watching this on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only YouTube history channel that wonders what communist manga would look like.